I took the job because it was easy money. Midnight shifts at a toll booth on an old highway that hardly saw any traffic. No boss breathing down my neck. No customers to deal with. Just me, a coffee thermos, and a stack of tickets. At least, that's what I thought. My first night started normal enough. I brought a book, set up my little radio, and leaned back in my chair, waiting for the occasional car to pass through. Hours crawled by in silence. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound, the buzz of the fluorescent light overhead, the distant rustling of trees, my own breath. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the first car arrived. A black sedan rolled to a stop. The driver, a pale man in his 50s, looked nervous. His hands trembled as he reached into his coat pocket. He handed me a single golden coin. "Don't look at the car behind me," he whispered. His voice was dry, cracked, like he hadn't spoken in days. I opened my mouth to ask him what he meant, but he hit the gas and sped off into the darkness before I could say a word. I leaned out of the booth, confused. There was no car behind him. Then I heard it, an engine, low and rumbling, like it was submerged underwater. I checked the booth's cameras, but they flickered to static. My radio cut out. The air inside the booth felt heavy, pressing against my chest like I was suddenly miles underground. I turned my head, just a little. At first, there was nothing, just the empty road. But then I noticed the absence of light, a shape, darker than the night itself, sitting in the lane where a car should have been. It wasn't a car. It wasn't anything I could describe. My eyes refused to focus on it, like my brain was rejecting the very idea of its existence. And then, it knocked on my window. My body locked up, a slow, deliberate tap-tap against the glass. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to keep looking straight ahead, remembering the man's warning. I reached for the intercom button with a shaking hand. Hello? No response. Just another tap-tap. Sweat dripped down my temple. I couldn't sit here forever. Slowly, I grabbed a ticket and slid it through the slot without looking. The ticket vanished. Not taken. Just gone. The presence lingered for a moment. Then the weight in the air lifted. The radio crackled back to life. The cameras flickered back on. And just like that, it was gone. The rest of my shift passed in unbearable silence. No more cars came. No sounds of distant engines. Just me, gripping the edge of the booth's desk until my knuckles turned white. At dawn, I stumbled out of the booth, barely remembering how to breathe. My supervisor arrived for the morning shift, sipping his coffee like everything was normal. "How was your first night?" he asked. I hesitated. "Weird," I said finally. "A guy came through and gave me a gold coin instead of cash." The supervisor's face paled. He set his coffee down slowly. "What did he tell you?" I swallowed. "He said, not to look at the car behind him." The supervisor exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "You listened, right?" I nodded. He studied me for a long time before sighing. "Good. Some people don't." I wanted to ask what happens to the ones who do, but the look in his eyes told me I wouldn't like the answer. At night 2, I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. Still, I showed up for my second shift, hoping, praying, that it would just be another boring night. It wasn't. Around 2 a.m., I started feeling it again. The weight in the air, the unnatural stillness, the sensation of being watched. Then, headlights appeared in the distance. This time, a white pickup truck pulled up. The driver, a young woman with wild eyes, thrust a crumpled dollar bill into my hand. "You need to close the booth," she whispered urgently. "What?" "Shut it down. Leave. Don't take any more tolls. If you stay, it will come back." I felt my throat tighten. "What are you talking about?" She glanced in her rearview mirror, terror flashing across her face. "It's already here." Then she floored the gas, tires screeching as she sped away into the night. My heart pounded. I turned toward the road. At first, it was empty. Then, The darkness began to shift. Something was standing there, not walking, not moving, just standing. I slammed my window shut, grabbed my radio, and called my supervisor. Static. No response. I reached for my keys. Maybe I could leave, just drive away. Then the tapping started again, but this time it was coming from inside the booth. A shadow stretched across the dimly lit interior. My breath hitched as I turned slowly, my reflection in the window distorting. No, changing. The figure was taller than me, thinner, with hollow eyes that weren't my own. A cold whisper slid across my ear. You saw. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the booth felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I blinked, and suddenly I was alone again. Had I imagined it, or had it just let me go, for now? I didn't know how much longer I could last here, but something told me night 3 was going to be worse. I took the job because I needed the money. The old roadside diner had been abandoned for years, but a new owner had restored it, hiring me as the night shift server. It wasn't exactly my dream gig, but the pay was decent. And besides, how many people could possibly come to an all-night diner in the middle of nowhere? At least, that's what I thought. My first night started quietly. I wiped down the counters, stacked menus, and leaned back against the counter, waiting for the occasional trucker to wander in. The radio played softly in the background. The neon sign buzzed outside, and the only company I had was the faint hum of the freezer. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the first customer arrived. A man in a faded grey suit walked in, his face gaunt and pale. He sat at the counter without a word, fingers tapping an odd rhythm against the surface. When I approached, he lifted his head slowly. "I'll have a coffee," he murmured, his voice distant, hollow. I nodded, grabbed the pot, and poured him a cup. But when I turned to hand it to him, he was gone. The stool sat empty. No sign of movement, no sound of the door opening. Just an untouched cup of steaming coffee. I stood frozen, my heart hammering. The diner suddenly felt too quiet. I checked the security camera feed, but there was nothing. Just an empty room. Then, the bell over the door jingled. Another customer, a woman in a blue dress, her hair neatly pinned up, entered and slid into the same seat the man had just occupied. She smiled politely. "Coffee, please." I hesitated, but poured her a cup. Unlike the man, she stayed. She sipped the coffee, glancing at the empty booths around her. "You get a lot of visitors this late?" she asked. "Not really," I admitted, wiping my hands on my apron. "You're actually the first real customer tonight." She set her cup down carefully. "Real?" My stomach twisted. I thought someone came in before you, but they just disappeared." The woman's face darkened. She glanced over her shoulder at the empty doorway. "Did he order coffee?" I blinked. "Yeah." She exhaled slowly. "That means you're in trouble." A chill ran down my spine. "What?" She pushed the cup aside. "You need to leave. Right now. Lock the doors. Turn off the sign." I stared at her, confused. "Why?" She opened her mouth, but a sudden sharp knock at the window made us both jump. I turned my head slowly. The man in the grey suit was standing outside, staring in. His hands pressed against the glass, his mouth moving soundlessly. Then, the lights flickered. The woman grabbed my wrist. "If you let him in, you'll never leave." The diner felt like it was shrinking around me. The windows seemed darker, the walls closer. The knock came again, louder, insistent. I backed away, my breath shallow. The woman grabbed my arm tighter. "Choose now. Lock the doors or open them." I hesitated. Then, the bell jingled again. I spun toward the door, but it had never opened. The man was gone, and so was the woman. The diner stood empty. Just me and 2 untouched cups of coffee, both still steaming. Night 2, I didn't quit. I should have. But something about the diner, about that night, wouldn't let me walk away. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupidity, maybe it was something else entirely. I arrived for my shift feeling uneasy, the air inside the diner heavier than before. I checked the coffee pot. Both cups from last night were still full, still hot. I dumped them and tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At 2:13 a.m., the door jingled. I turned, expecting another ghostly visitor. Instead, a man in a trucker cap, face worn from years on the road, strode in and took a seat at the counter. He nodded at me, pulled out a cigarette, then seemed to think better of it and shoved it back in his pocket. "Cup of coffee?" I asked. He nodded. "And a piece of pie if you got it." Relieved at the normalcy, I grabbed a plate of pie and poured his coffee. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, then glanced up at me. "You work here long?" "First week," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "Thought so. They don't last long." My stomach twisted. "Who?" "The night staff." He took another sip of coffee. "How many have you seen?" I swallowed hard. "2." His eyes darkened. "Did one warn you?" I nodded. He set his cup down. "Then you need to listen. When it comes back, do not acknowledge it. No eye contact, no words, just keep moving." The air around us grew colder. The lights flickered. I turned toward the door. The man in the grey suit was back. His hollow eyes locked onto mine, and this time he stepped inside. The trucker grabbed my wrist. "Don't move." The man in the suit walked to the counter and sat in the same stool as before. His hands folded neatly. The air felt suffocating. "Coffee," he said softly. The trucker didn't move. Neither did I. The man's fingers drummed against the counter. I said, "Coffee." The trucker leaned toward me, whispering so softly I barely heard him. "If you serve him, you're his." I gritted my teeth. The lights flickered wildly now, the neon sign outside buzzing like a dying fly. The man in the suit tilted his head. His mouth curved into something resembling a smile. "You saw me," he said. The diner felt like it was caving in. Then, suddenly, the trucker slammed his fist on the counter. The man in the suit vanished. The lights steadied. The trucker exhaled. "You're lucky." I stared at the empty stool, heart hammering. "What happens if you serve him?" The trucker met my eyes. "You don't want to know." Outside, in the distance, the neon sign flickered again. And, for the first time, I truly wondered if I would make it to night 3. I took the job because I needed the money. The gas station was off a long, lonely stretch of highway, the kind of place people only stopped at when they were desperate. The manager didn't ask many questions, just handed me a key and told me to keep an eye on the pumps. At least, that's what I thought. My first shift was uneventful. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a radio behind the counter played old country songs. A handful of cars passed through, mostly truckers fueling up before the long haul. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the first strange thing happened. An old station wagon rolled up to pump number 3. I waited for the driver to step out, but he never did. The engine clicked off. The headlights stayed on, bathing the empty highway in a yellow glow. I squinted, trying to see through the windshield. A man sat in the driver's seat, perfectly still. Too still. I couldn't see his face, just a shadowed outline. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. Finally, I stepped outside, shivering as the cold air bit through my jacket. I approached the car slowly, tapping on the driver's window. "Need any help?" The man turned his head too slowly, like a puppet being moved by invisible strings. His face was wrong. The features were there, eyes, nose, mouth, but they looked borrowed, stitched together in a way that didn't belong. His lips curled up into a grin that felt practiced, like he had learned it from watching someone else. "No gas," he whispered. My stomach clenched. What?" The man's grin widened, too far. "No gas," he repeated. Then, without turning the key, the station wagon's engine rumbled to life. The headlights flickered, and then he was gone. No tires screeched, no dust kicked up, just gone, like he had never been there. I stood frozen, breath visible in the cold air. The pump's meter still read 0. Then, the door chime jingled. I turned slowly, expecting a customer. Instead, a woman stood in the doorway, her wide eyes scanning the station. She was drenched in sweat, breathing hard like she had just been running. Her clothes were torn, her hands scratched. She locked eyes with me. "Did he stop here?" I swallowed hard. "Who?" "The man in the station wagon." I didn't answer. Her face paled. "If you saw him, you need to leave. Now." The air inside the station thickened, like it was pressing against my chest. The humming of the fluorescent lights grew louder, buzzing like a nest of angry wasps. The woman grabbed my wrist. "Listen to me. If he comes back, don't speak to him. Don't look at his reflection. And whatever you do, don't let him inside." A sharp knock at the window made us both jump. I turned. The man was back. Only this time, he wasn't alone. The parking lot was filled with cars, all idling, all filled with figures sitting perfectly still, their faces just a little too wrong, and every single one of them was smiling at me. Night 2. I should have quit. Any sane person would have. But something about the gas station, about what happened that night, wouldn't let me walk away. I came back the next night, telling myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion. I was wrong. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the station wagon returned. But this time, the pumps turned on by themselves. The numbers climbed rapidly, faster than they should have. 10 gallons, 20, 30. The nozzle hadn't even been lifted. Then, the power flickered. The radio crackled, cutting out mid-song. The temperature dropped, my breath fogging the air, and then, from outside, a whisper, too close. "No gas." I whipped around. The station wagon was empty, but the reflection in the window wasn't mine. I ran to the door. I fumbled for the keys, hands shaking, desperate to lock it. The door swung open by itself. The man in the grey station wagon stepped inside. He wasn't grinning anymore. He tilted his head, studying me. "You stayed." I backed up. I don't know what you are." He stepped closer. "I do." The power cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the gas station. The only light came from the flickering neon sign outside. His voice whispered in the dark. "You saw me." Then, suddenly, the lights flashed back on. The man was gone. The station was empty. Only one thing had changed. The security camera screen behind the counter now showed dozens of cars parked outside, and every single driver was staring at me. I took the job because I needed the money. The motel was off an old highway, the kind of place people only stopped at when they had no other options. The manager barely spoke to me, just handed me a set of keys and told me to cover the front desk from midnight to dawn. At least, that's what I thought. My first shift was quiet. Too quiet. The neon vacancy sign buzzed outside, flickering against the dark. The old carpet smelled like mildew, and the only sounds were the hum of the vending machine and the occasional creak of the wind against the old walls. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the bell above the front door rang. A man in a long coat stepped inside. His face was obscured by shadows, but his hands, pale and long-fingered, rested on the front desk. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, fingers tapping an uneven rhythm against the counter. Finally, he whispered, "Room 6. I glanced at the registry. Room 6 hadn't been rented out in months. The door was supposed to be broken. The key missing. I hesitated. I'm not sure if that room is available." The man slowly lifted his head. His face was wrong. His features were there. Eyes, nose, mouth. But they didn't quite fit together. "Room 6, he repeated, voice softer this time, but firm. A shiver ran down my spine, but I reached for the key rack out of habit. My hand froze. The key to room 6 was already missing. My breath hitched. Someone already has that room. The man didn't react. He just smiled, too wide, and turned away. The bell above the door jingled again, and then he was gone. I leaned over the desk to look outside. Nothing. No footsteps in the dirt, no car in the lot. The parking lot was empty. Then the phone rang. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. Swallowing hard, I picked up the receiver. Front desk. A voice whispered, "Don't let him in." My stomach dropped. Who is this? The line went dead. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I looked toward the hallway that led to the rooms. Room 6's door was slightly ajar. It had been locked earlier. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the inside of the door. Night 2. I should have left. I wanted to leave. But I came back the next night, convincing myself that exhaustion had gotten the best of me. Maybe I had imagined it. I was wrong. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the bell jingled again. A woman this time. Pale skin, dark eyes, moving too smoothly, like she was gliding instead of walking. She placed one hand on the counter, long fingers resting lightly. "Room 6, she whispered. My stomach clenched. "That room isn't available." Her lips curled into something that might have been a smile. "It's waiting." The air around us thickened. The lights above flickered. I could feel the walls pressing in, as if the entire motel was breathing. Then, from the hallway, the door to room 6 creaked open. I turned toward it, pulse pounding in my ears. Something stood in the doorway. Not the man, not the woman, something else. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it smiling at me. The woman at the desk whispered, "You should leave." The lights went out. The bell above the door jingled, and when the lights flickered back on, I was alone. Only one thing had changed. The key to room 6 was back on the rack, and it was dripping wet. I took the job because I needed the money. The toll booth was on an old, barely used highway that stretched for miles through dense, fog-covered woods. The supervisor handed me a key, told me to keep the booth locked at night, and warned me not to accept any payments after 2:13 a.m. At least that's what I thought. My first shift was quiet, too quiet. The streetlights along the highway flickered in the distance, and the only sounds were the distant rustling of trees and the occasional croak of a frog from the nearby swamp. Hours passed with barely a single car coming through. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the first car arrived. A black sedan rolled up, its headlights cutting through the fog. The driver, a pale man in a suit that looked decades out of date, didn't speak at first. He just reached out, offering me a single golden coin. I frowned. "Sir, we don't take these." The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Take it." My hand moved on its own, fingers closing around the coin. A jolt of cold shot up my arm. The moment the coin touched my palm, the car's engine revved, and the vehicle sped off into the night without another word. I looked down at the coin. The surface was smooth, but the longer I stared, the more it seemed to shift, almost like something inside it was moving. A whisper, just on the edge of hearing, slithered through my mind. Then I heard it. A low, rumbling engine. Another car was pulling up, but the headlights weren't on. The cameras flickered to static. My radio cut out. The air inside the booth became heavy, suffocating. Something was outside. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see a dark shape idling where the next car should have been. It wasn't a car. It wasn't anything I could describe. The outline shifted, like it was made of liquid shadow, and then it knocked on my window. A slow, deliberate tap-tap. My stomach twisted. My grip on the coin tightened. I knew, deep down, that if I turned to face it fully, something would happen. Something I couldn't take back. I forced myself to look straight ahead. My trembling fingers reached for a ticket and blindly pushed it through the slot. The ticket vanished. Not taken, just gone. The presence lingered. The air around me pulsed. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it disappeared. The cameras flickered back to life. The static on my radio cleared, and I was alone again. At dawn, I stumbled out of the booth, barely breathing. My supervisor was waiting for me, sipping his coffee like it was just another morning. "How was your first night?" he asked. I hesitated. "Weird," I admitted. "A guy gave me a gold coin." The supervisor's face paled. He set his coffee down, staring at me. "Did you keep it?" I swallowed. Yeah. His jaw clenched. "You need to get rid of it. Now." I reached into my pocket. The coin was gone. Night 2, I told myself it was just exhaustion, that maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew better. Still, I showed up for my second shift, hoping, praying, that it would just be a normal night. It wasn't. At 2:13 a.m., a white pickup truck pulled up. The driver, a woman with hollow eyes, leaned out of the window. "You need to close the booth." I blinked. "Excuse me?" She glanced at the empty highway behind her, fear flashing across her face. "If you stay here, it will come back." A cold weight settled in my chest. "What are you talking about?" She opened her mouth, but a sudden sharp knock at my window made us both freeze. I turned my head slowly. The booth was dark. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered wildly. The security cameras filled with static. Something was standing right outside. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it staring at me. The woman in the truck gasped, "Don't look at it." The knocking grew louder, more urgent. The glass shook under the force. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe. "What happens if I do?" The woman's face twisted in horror. "You don't want to know." The knocking stopped. For a second, everything was silent. Then the radio crackled. A voice, not human, not mechanical, but something in between, whispered through the speaker. "You took the coin." My blood ran cold. The lights cut out completely. And in the darkness, something opened the booth door from the inside. The air shifted, dense and unearthly, as if the space itself was folding inward. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I could hear something moving inside the booth with me. A cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. A deep, rattling breath filled the room, except it wasn't mine. My knees locked as I reached for the door, but my fingers barely grazed the handle before it slammed shut on its own. Then the whispering began. Countless voices, murmuring in an unknown language, filled the booth. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My radio crowled back to life. A single voice cut through the whispers. "Run!" The lights flared back on, and I didn't hesitate. I threw open the door and ran, stumbling onto the empty highway. When I turned back, the toll booth was still there. But the door was wide open, and inside, a figure stood in my place, watching me.